Hello and welcome to the American Compass podcast. My name is Oren. I'm the chief economist at American Compass, and today we are talking with Breitbart's economics editor, John Carney, who is one of my favorite commentators on, frankly, everything going on in the economy, because he actually looks at what is happening, looks at what the data says, and analyzes it instead of quoting a not very relevant paragraph from an economics textbook. So was very excited to have him on. He'd actually written a great piece for Commonplace called Zoran's Park Slope Populists, looking at the coalition that actually supported Zoran Mamdani in New York and the thinking behind it, and actually some of the parallels to the rise of Donald Trump. It was a great piece, one of the most popular we've ever published. And so really, use that as a jumping off point for a broader discussion of what's going on with populism in America, what's going on with the Trump administration agenda, and how to make sense of what's happening in the economy. So I had a great time talking with him. Think you'll really enjoy it. But before we get to that, of course, have to tell you about everything else going on at Commonplace. A lot of good stuff this week. We had Chris Emper on the need to fund community health centers and the advantages of just having the government provide access to health care instead of just subsidizing insurance companies. Mike Lind on why we shouldn't reclaim the term mercantilism. I must admit, I was sort of thinking maybe we should reclaim the term, but Lind makes a lot of really good points and also just a lot of really interesting history. And then a great piece from Ryan Jerdusky on the Searchlight Institute, which is a left-of-center effort to find a path forward for the Democratic Party. I always love contrasting the Searchlight branding with the Compass branding. One suggests there is a true north and we must navigate by it. The other suggests we're just sort of scanning haplessly around trying to find something, but we, of course, wish them a lot of luck. And Ryan has some thoughts on how that's going. So enjoy all of that. Lighter schedule coming up next week, but we will certainly have a special family-themed podcast for your long Thanksgiving minivan ride home. Look forward to that. And right now, enjoy John Carney. And we are joined now by Breitbart's John Carney. John, thank you for coming on the podcast.
Hey, Oren, thanks for having me.
It's great to see you. You are on my list of people who actually think about and study and try to understand what is happening in the economy and with trade and immigration, rather than just quoting in opposite bits out of economics textbooks, which I always appreciate. And you wrote a fantastic piece for Commonplace. You actually wrote a little while ago on Zoran's Park Slope Populists, which proved quite prescient for how things actually went, and I think ultimately applies beyond New York to a lot we are seeing in the political winds these days. So we will get to a lot of stuff, but wanted to start there. What is a Park Slope populist?
So I used to live until quite recently in Park Slope, Brooklyn. It is an area full of what I would call sort of middle-class professionals, probably upper middle-class professionals, people who have, quite nice jobs in finance, law, media, advertising, just very New York kind of jobs. But they have been falling behind for years now. They live in apartments that are getting ever more expensive. They really haven't seen their incomes go up by very much. And they feel that they've been sort of left behind. And they have. It's not just a feeling on their part. They really have not seen the kind of improvement to their lives that they would have expected over years of working. So years go by, they find that they're kind of stuck in the same place, and that the path of advancement that people who had these roles before no longer seems open. That 25 years ago, 35, 45 years ago, people in their place could expect a kind of upward trajectory in their lifestyle. That's not happening to these people who are living in Park Slope. And so, what I saw back in July when I first wrote the piece for American Compass was that what Mamdani was promising them was basically a populist message, was saying, you don't have to accept that your lives will be worse off than your parents' lives or than you expected. We can do something to improve it. And frankly, this reminded me of Donald Trump's message in 2016 that we weren't going to, as As Steve Bannon used to like to say a lot, we weren't going to manage the decline anymore.
Hmm.
We're going to try to reverse it, stop it, stand athwart history, yell, stop, no more decline. Uh, and that's what Mandani was promising. And I thought that this deserved a lot more attention than either the left was giving it, or the right, frankly. The right was calling them like champagne socialists and making fun of them for whining, even though they had $100,000 incomes. My point was that those incomes weren't supporting them the way they used to, and their prospects, even more importantly, had narrowed dramatically.
Yeah. The comparison to Trump is so interesting because I think you're exactly right in sort of the rhetoric and the frame. Trump, of course, had a clear diagnosis. This is what has happened that has caused this.
Right.
What is that for the Park Slope populist? What is the set of economic forces that or bad policy choices that are that are leading to this problem?
So it's related, but a little less obvious, right? So for Trump, we had China's admission to the WTO was a big part when we had studies that showed that, this had wiped out the Midwest manufacturing base. I do think that high levels of immigration, and particularly visa workers who come in and can compete with American workers, are holding down professionals. I think so that's one part of it. I do think that a lot of these jobs actually, some of the work they do has been outsourced to foreign countries. So we're seeing increasingly professional firms in New York City and in Los Angeles and in San Francisco rely on for what you might consider like some of the grunt work of the professional class, rely on foreign sort of outsourcing firms to do some of that.
Hmm.
Now that saves money if you're the firm, and it's totally understandable why they're doing that. But it means that the training that like a young person's able to get at at an advertising firm or a law firm is actually narrowing. They're no longer seeing the prospect. I also think there's probably been an overproduction of the professional class, frankly, that we have graduated a ton of people from law schools, from business schools, and I'm not talking about like the Harvard law students will always find a job at a big law firm. They're, the Yale law students, they'll be fought over. But the second tier law students are actually finding it much harder to get ahead. Now, I don't like to call part of it, you could call it overproduction of those graduates. But what we've done is not made sure that the economy is keeping up with the production of graduates. Like if we are not creating the opportunities for them, then we should think about whether or not we should be encouraging people to take on the kind of debt they've been encouraged to take on to get these degrees.
Yeah, well, I think it goes one level back from that, even just to the overproduction of bachelor's degrees. I mean, I
Sure.
remember we did a study on this a couple of years ago at Compass, just looking at, Bureau of Labor Statistics buckets jobs by sort of expected credential. And what we found was that actually the rate at which we had been increasing the output of bachelor's degrees holders was roughly double the rate we were actually creating jobs that that they were classifying as being appropriate for somebody with a degree. And so the funny thing in my mind is like when I think about, lawyers or bankers or whatever, I would kind of say like, well, actually we don't want an economy that's creating a lot more demand for those necessarily. Sure. But speaking a little bit more broadly, it does seem, you could even say we don't necessarily want an economy that leans more heavily toward knowledge work overall, but certainly as a matter of a mismatch, we clearly have a cultural message and education system and conception of professional success that does not connect to the actual valuable things that people can be doing in the world in a lot of cases.
And to connect these up, so what happens is you eliminate a huge part of your product producing, manufacturing jobs. And then you tell people, well, that's okay. Go to college and there will be a professional uh, white collar job waiting for you. So give up your blue collar jobs and get the white collar job. And that turns out to not have worked, right? So we gave up the blue collar jobs, told people to go to college, told people to go to graduate school, and the jobs weren't there for them. The opportunities did not grow at the rate of that the opportunities at the blue collar jobs were being eliminated. So yes, we overproduced this class, but one of the reasons we overproduced it is because we were eliminating the other jobs that they otherwise could have taken. So people almost had no choice but to, like learn to code became the big joke, right? Because we were telling people to learn to code. Guess what? People who learn to code are actually now part of the class of people who are finding that it is very hard to get a job that can keep up with the cost of living in a place like New York City or San Francisco.
Yeah, it's funny. The one of the worst habits of the economist is the sort of hand waving. Well, in the aggregate and in the abstract, surely this is happening somewhere, right? And so,
Right.
There was the initial case was, of course, well, with all the offshoring and whatever else, we're just going to create much better jobs for everybody. And, you mentioned the China shock research by David Otter and his colleagues. Their most recent paper, which I think is especially insightful on this, is they say, well, like, let's look at the kinds of jobs that came into these communities instead. Because,
Right.
some folks, especially sort of from the old right, will say, like, look at all the jobs, look at the unemployment rate. Obviously, there's no problem here. And what Otter finds is, no, actually, if you look at the jobs that you got instead, they are much more precarious, lower wage, frontline service jobs typically. And that's where people might wave their hands and say, like, okay, well, sure, left behind communities aren't where the opportunity is. That's why we need everybody to, move to New York and San Francisco where it's really happening. And then to your point, it's not actually really happening there either. For a small sliver of people it is, but it is a kind of recursive repeat of this story for the next set of next set of folks one rung higher on the ladder.
I've actually had people in Brooklyn tell me that life in New York City feels like a season of Hunger Game, where they're all out. Only one can possibly survive. Everybody else is going to get left behind. Now they're literally not getting killed, but that's actually not so far off. Where yes, maybe 1 in 10 will get ahead and do well, but that didn't used to be the deal for the professional class. They actually used to say, just like, by the way, it didn't used to be the deal
Right.
for people in manufacturing. Work hard, get the training that you need, and the American dream is there open for you. Not everybody will be successful. A lot of people will have either personal foibles or just bad luck where they won't, things won't work out for them. But there was a very good chance of it. What we're seeing now is there's not. And it's funny because from some elements of the right, I was hearing some of the messages that we thought, were really obnoxious when they got aimed at like Midwest industrial workers. Sort of, well, why do you have to live in that expensive neighborhood in Brooklyn? Why don't you move? Get lost. What are you doing? Move to a poorer neighborhood. Again, that's a message of like, lower your expectations for your life. Why are you so concerned about whether your kids are in a good school? You're spoiled. You should, get used to life being worse than you expected. And
Right.
that's a terrible political message, frankly. And the politician who can, and again, I don't think Mandami has a very good, you asked about this in the beginning. I don't think he has a very good story about why this happened or necessarily what to do about it. But sometimes just being the guy who's willing to, stand up and say, yeah, I see it. That matters a lot.
Yeah. It's Hunger Game, exactly right. I've been calling it the Squid Game economy, but Hunger Games is
That's more up
probably
to
a
date.
little.
Squid Game
What's
is
that?
that's more
Yeah.
up to date. Squid Games
Yeah.
is more recent
No,
than
but
Hunger
Hunger
Games.
Games, it's probably the more accessible cultural reference, just because, like, the fascinating thing about it is, like, well, technically everybody does have equal opportunity, right? Like,
Sure.
it actually fits very well with, like, well, the American dream is equal opportunity, and you all go as far as you can. And it's like, we've been doing some focus group work, and the sense that sort of like, but the economy has sort of become a lottery, and like,
Right.
yes, there is a winner, And like we all acknowledge the winner's doing very well. And in fact, we all acknowledge we potentially have a chance to be the winner. But it is I guess the sociologists or the economists would say it's sort of the winner take all phenomenon where you used to still it's not like one person wins and everyone else gets killed gruesomely. It used to be maybe one person wins and everyone else also has a good and decent life. And the
Well, I also
divergence
think the
has gotten much
class
worse.
of winners has narrowed. So
Hmm.
you see this in a lot of professional firms where the chances that you'll make it to the top is actually a lot lower than it used to be. So it's hurt on both ends. Losing is worse, and the number and the share of winners is smaller. So I think that's one of the reasons why you get people who say, yeah, I used to think that it was good enough that everybody had the opportunity, but to be successful. But that sort of breaks down when the opportunity becomes very narrow and the cost of not being the winner becomes very large.
Yeah, that's well put. The so the to your point about Mamdani, not necessarily having the best diagnosis or the best or any relevant solutions, is a common feature of populism, certainly. And it seems to me we are increasingly in a moment now on both sides of the political spectrum where I guess you'd say maybe the populism is better than the, 2014 style oblivious neoliberalism. Like
Right.
one step at a time, but it does feel like you now have two political parties that are honing into on, what is the right register of anger in which to speak, but are really almost out competing each other for then not actually delivering in a way that is well well received by anybody.
Well,
Um,
I
Go ahead.
think one of the problems that to just focus on the Trump administration had is that Donald Trump, when he got elected president, on his platform of lower immigration and fair trade, really came in without any supporting intellectual apparatus. There had been, people like me, you, Alan Tonelson, like who had been writing, but there wasn't, unlike when, say, like Reagan came in
Hmm.
1980, and there had been a conservative movement advocating the things that Reagan would eventually try to govern on for decades, but even just more closely, a Reagan movement that had been around him, and Ed Meese and Art Laffer and all these guys developing, Jack Kemp developing a both legislative and intellectual platform to back up what he was going to do. Trump's election was much more of a shock, and I have a theory about why that was. I think the Republican Party had become much more closed-minded.
Hmm.
It had basically shut out any dissent. And so Trump comes and gets elected on this platform that the Republican Party was unable at first to embrace. I think that's improved. You're a testament to that, frankly. That we've had some time. The intellectual apparatus is building. I think Trump's approach to tariffs is actually smarter than it used to be, meaning they really do look at it as a way. JD Vance just said this in a conversation with Breitbart's Matt Boyle in Washington, D.C. He said that the very first principle when asked about Trump trade was, we want to use our trade policies to open markets to American goods, right? Using that's not something we heard as well articulated in the
Hmm.
first administration. So they thought about it more, and they're more intentionally, I think, using the policy. Whether or not it's being executed, with flawlessly, it's probably not. No government policy is, but I think they're better at it than they used to.
Yeah. And do you think, I mean, looking at the polling, certainly at this point, there is, favorability ratings. There's just a
Yeah.
new, generic congressional ballot where Democrats had been struggling mightily and now Republicans seem to now be struggling even more mightily. Um, what is the flip side of it? What does it look like to actually spin this forward on either side and start to actually be successful? Because it feels to me that we're at a moment now where either side could hypothetically start to get this right in a way that um, build significant political support. I think the Democrats have some much larger headwinds, just given all of the other progressive priorities, shall we say, that they
Sure.
have to cope with. Um, but what would you be looking for to say, oh, like somebody's actually, they're not just flipping through the air, like this is what would stick the landing?
Right. A couple of things. One, I think that they need to have I get it that sort of the first year they had to do a sort of lot of shock and awe because they were trying to really reset things. We're 1 year from election day, more or less. We now need to move from like the shock and awe approach where like people keep waking up and being like, wait, what's the new policy? To a thing where they say, okay, no, I see now where this is working. I think Donald Trump himself personally should try to do a better job of articulating the consistency of the approach. I think you've done a great job at Breitbart. I try to really lay out for people like how to think about the way the immigration policy ties in with the trade policy.
Mm-hmm.
That sort of coherent vision, if well articulated, I think will bring Americans along. You can't count on the media to help you out. You're going to,
Right.
you have to go around them. You have to do fireside chats to directly address the American people. Trump's good at rallies, maybe do more rallies, but you want to present this as a consistent path to an improved economy and not as sort of like wake up and every day everybody's surprised about what's happening. I think that, the may or may not have been necessary in the beginning. Now you have those policies in place. You need to let people understand how they're working better. And I also think the Trump administration has the advantage of time. Doing the
Mm-hmm.
tariffs in April, doing the tax bill over the summer, not waiting for this stuff means that it's very likely, I think, that by May of 2026, people will feel better about the economy. And that we may look back at this as sort of the nadir of Trump popularity, and that things, given time, the tariffs, the immigration policies, the deregulation, and frankly, probably the most important thing, and I know it's like almost too traditional Republican, but the immediate expensing of capital
Mm-hmm.
investment in both factories and equipment will really, I think, help. And so I think that we may be like having a different conversation next summer, which will be very helpful to Republicans in the midterm.
Yeah, I think shock and awe is, I think, a good way of putting it. And I certainly think it was necessary. Both, I've referred to as sort of the demolition phase before you can start,
Right.
building something. And then that, of course, leaves you the question like, okay, well, now you do have to build. You can't just go
Right.
find more to demolish.
Let's see
Um,
what the ballroom looks like after you've knocked it down.
that's right. That's a very nice concrete example. Um, But to your point about the sort of how we perceive the economy, what's actually going on in the economy, that's been another very interesting dimension of this, in part because the Trump policy is so different from the norm. Economists have really struggled to even interpret what's happening. I mean, my favorite one is like, oh well, like you didn't add a lot of jobs last month, even though the unemployment rate is still low. Like, how could that be? And it's like, well, let
Right.
us introduce you to a restrictionist immigration policy. And they're like, well, we've never heard of that, and we don't know how to talk about it. And so, then you have obviously everything that's going on with the tariffs. What is your read on what's actually going on, and what are the metrics that you watch most closely?
So I was really happy you brought up this thing about the about jobs numbers, because economists really blew it on this. They really missed the idea that when you have a restrictionist immigration policy, your need to create 200,000 jobs every month goes away. We can do very well with 35,000 jobs. And in fact, I think what we should really be concentrating on is not the number of jobs. And I've actually said that it's probably going to take even politicians, even Republicans, even some Trump people, sort of get this wrong still because we spent so many years, particularly under Barack Obama, of having a job deficit. We just did not
Hmm.
have enough jobs for Americans that our politics really became structured around, can we create enough jobs? Just get people employed. We had, 8, 9% unemployment. This was a crisis that went on for way too long. We're in a different situation. Unemployment is below 5%. And I think as long as it's below 5%, what you should really be thinking about is the quality of jobs and not just the number of jobs. So yes, we will still, and that's harder to, frankly, it's harder to tell because our economic statistics are really built around the Keynesian notion that you're always going to underproduce jobs. And so you just want to count how many jobs you have,
Yeah,
and the quality doesn't matter. So I think
that's a great point. I have to toss in one thing there. I had actually thought about this in a little while. A few years ago, I wrote something saying, why are we only reporting the jobs number? If we're taking the time to collect that data, why don't we just also ask three simple questions about the nature of the job, and then
yeah,
actually, create class A, B, C, and D jobs and report how many you actually have in each in in each column. And to your point, the answer is like, because that's not how economists think. It's just the number of jobs.
right, exactly. They think, how many jobs are you adding? And I think so. Going, for the next couple of years at least, I think that, and then we'll add to that. So I think that concentrating on the number of jobs is wrong. Part of the reason for that is also because you can create many more jobs if you just open your borders, right? If you open your borders, you'll have a ton of people who are willing to work for almost nothing come into your country, and you will have jobs numbers that you could, if you want 200,000, that's fine. You could probably make 500. You could make them, if you go Matt Iglesias and say we want 1 billion Americans, you can have 500,000 jobs a month if you just let everybody who wants to come into the country come in. So that's obviously the wrong way of doing things. You could also expand jobs by just taking over entire countries. If we take over the nation of Colombia, then our job numbers go up by exactly how many jobs there are in Colombia. So that's obviously not the right metric to be using. What we should be doing is caring about both the quality of jobs, how secure people feel in those jobs, I think is very important, and what people's sort of lifetime upward mobility in those jobs. Like, do they feel like they're, not that, I don't believe like a 22-year-old necessarily should feel like he could buy a house, right? He could live in an apartment with his friends or live with his parents. But does he feel like by the time he's 35, he'll be able to own a house where he can raise a family, and that by the time he's 65, he'll be able to retire and, watch his grandkids grow up? Like, that is how we should be thinking about it. I think it'll take time for politicians to adjust, and economists will just never adjust. They'll the economy will be doing great 10 years from now, and they'll still be being like, oh, tut tut, not enough jobs being created. And then the economic effects of immigration restriction is a big deal. The best estimates are right now that we could probably create 30 to 50,000 jobs each month, and that's fine to keep up with the population growth that we'll have with the restricted immigration policy. So that means, when you get 119, that's a very good number. But I saw people, when the government announced this week that we created 119,000 jobs, I saw some economists, including, some pretty distinguished ones, being like, oh, that's kind of a weakish report. I said, wait a minute. Sure, it's weakish if you have open borders. When
Right.
you don't, it's actually a very good report.
Yeah. Well, it's a good point. The flip side of it also, because of course, during the Biden administration, when you had literally millions of people pouring across the border, and then economists were saying, look at this strong economy, look at this, look at this job growth, look at this GDP growth. It's like, well, yes, you just increased the population by 1%, so you got 1% of GDP growth, but that's not actually growth in any meaningful way.
It
And so
doesn't
I think
help
there's actually,
people that you're supposed to
that's
be
right.
helping.
Right. And there's a funny way, I think, I think you're exactly right. It with sort of without net immigration inflows, 30, 50,000 jobs a month is, full potential in a sense. If you're actively removing people, In fact, it's even lower. And so that's, using those. Actually, funny, I think actually AEI did a very good paper on, what does this look like under various migration scenarios. If you're actually removing people at the rate the Trump administration is, a zero can
Right.
be a good number. And that's where it's like, gee, if only we had some measure that asked how many jobs there were relative to the number of people looking for jobs. It's like, oh, we do. It's the unemployment rate, which,
Right.
as you said, is low. Like this is not that hard. As with most things in the Trump administration, I find you have to be trying extremely hard to miss the point to produce analysis as bad as a lot of people seem to put out.
No, that's right. And I think that keeping an eye on the unemployment rate and also noticing why, when it changes, why does it change? Did the unemployment rate go up because you're bringing more people back into the workforce? That's a good reason. So when you have a labor force participation rate go up, that's good. Did it go down because people are leaving the workforce? That's not great. Or is it, if it is going up because you're letting in too many people, that's also not good. So you really want to pay attention both to the unemployment rate and then the causes of the change of the unemployment rate. And again, this is something economists should be able to do, right? The numbers are there. We collect the data. They should be able to do it. Instead, I mean, I'm not convinced that we may be that. Hopefully, they're smarter than this. But basically, the National Bureau of Economic Research, the way they calculate whether you're in a recession,
right?
They could one day say that we're in a recession because it's been 6 months and we had zero job growth. And yet we have, unemployment, holding steady because, as you were saying, if we're removing people who shouldn't be in the United States, we can actually continue to grow the economy, particularly if we're increasing productivity. One of the pieces that I have out recently, it's actually coming in my Breitbart Business Digest, argues that we were in a kind of low wage, low productivity equilibrium where businesses did not have to invest in raising productivity because they could just hire more workers. We can move the economy. And I think the Trump administration's policies are actually perfectly aligned to do this, to a new equilibrium, which is a high productivity, high wage economy. That will look bad if you use the statistics you use to measure the low wage, low productivity economy. Right. But you need to pay attention to the new paradigm for the economy if you really want to understand what's going on.
That's a great point. And probably, I mean, the ideal disaggregation there is GDP growth is productivity growth plus population growth, essentially,
right?
With some workforce participation and so forth mixed in. It's very funny to see I always remember Jared Bernstein, who's probably Biden's chief economic advisor. He would just explicitly make the argument the reason we need sort of expansionist immigration policy is because that's the only way we will get growth.
Right.
And it was like, no, that is not why we thought we were paying attention to growth in the first place. We thought we could pay attention to growth because you were going to have a reasonable immigration policy, and it would therefore be a proxy for productivity growth and real improvements in living standards. If you reverse engineer that and manage to the metric instead of to the real world, you get exactly that mindset. And it really forces us to say, no, okay, it's growth for its own sake is not the project here. Productivity growth, creating better, higher paying jobs is the project. And fortunately, if that's what we want to measure, we can measure that.
Right. I had this conversation with a very old economist, actually, who I won't name because I didn't ask him if I could tell this story, but he 100% agreed with what you just said. So he said, look, growth used to be GDP growth was a very good proxy for the improvement of the lives of Americans. When you have a reasonable immigration policy, then, and so you're not gaming it by trying to grow through growing immigration, then GDP growth was great. So he said, when we talked about growth in the Reagan administration, or even earlier, we were talking about growth for Americans. And yes, we had some immigrants and we had some immigration. We included them. when what happened was exactly as you just said, they started to game it by saying, well, we can grow the economy just by bringing more people in. That breaks that measure. It's GDP growth is no longer a measure of the improvement of the lives of Americans. It's just a measure of how many people you're adding to the economy. That's not what people elect policymakers for. When a politician says, I'm going to grow the economy, I think most people implicitly hear for you, right? They don't mean for, by inviting everybody in, because that just raises the question. Well, as you said, what good is growth? Who is it good for if it's not improving the lives of Americans?
Right. Well, it is also good for corporations, which get cheaper labor and more sales and higher profits.
And the CEO's
let's not forget them.
That's the CEO's salaries go up because the larger it doesn't matter who they're selling to. Their sales numbers go up. The size of the corporation grows, and their salaries go up. So you're right. Again, it does definitely benefit a small subset of people, and it definitely helps Wall Street and it helps large corporations, but it doesn't help most American people. And that's one of the reasons, frankly, we had this populist uprising, because I think both parties, Democrats and Republicans, had lost track of this idea. The Republicans, I'd argue, actually lost track of it earlier than the Democrats. Then the Democrats had also lost track of it. And that opened the pathway for Donald Trump, who said, this is broken. Like, the economy should be working for you and not just, as you said, growth for growth's sake.
Yeah, it's my favorite quote from Steve Moore, the founder of Club for Growth, Wall Street Journal editorial board member. He said, cheap labor leads to a rising stock market. That benefits everybody. And I was like, what? Depends how big your everybody is, I suppose.
And by the way, I'd like to say that that's not true. We have been, Donald Trump has put on tariffs, restricted immigration, and the stock market is rising. So I think even that correlation was spurious. The stock market will rise because of the health of the American economy, and it doesn't actually. I think that you don't actually need cheap labor to grow the value of the asset value of equities. And I mean that. Not everybody, I've tried to talk to some investors about this. Some of them actually buy into it now. And it's one of the reasons I think stock market keeps going up. So actually, yeah, we can do this. We see the program and we think this will work. Some of them are still skeptical and they still want, low labor costs and they think that'll work. But when I present to them the two equilibrium idea, that you can have growth with large population growth and immigration and low wages and low productivity, or you could have high productivity, low immigration, and still have growth. They're like, okay, that makes sense. And therefore, by the way, stocks can go up because you still get growth.
Well, we have almost made it to the end of the conversation without mentioning AI. But since you've talked about the performance of the stock market, well, toss it in as just a final bit here, because I would like to look at the market performance and say, this sort of generally validates the direction we're headed. These are the people with skin in the game. Part of me also looks at the market performance and says, well, this is sort of an insane AI bubble. And if you were to put that to the side, the market's not really telling us much of anything. Where do you come down on that piece of it?
So, of course, I am always a little bit of like a bearish pessimist when I see stocks go up a lot, I start to get worried. But a couple thoughts about that is, one, it doesn't mean that that the technological and productive promise is not true, right? So it could be that a lot of these companies are overvalued and people are going to lose their shirts betting on them. Just like people lost their shirts, and companies spent too much money in the dot-com bubble, right? In the late 1990s, where AOL and Yahoo were going to be the future, right? Sure, that didn't work out, but we have Amazon, we have Google, we have Meta. This really did create value in. You could argue maybe some of it hasn't always been great, but it created at least value for shareholders over time. And I think some of it really did improve our lives. You and I are able to have this conversation right now
Hmm.
because people over-investing in the dot-com bubble back in 1999. I think that is actually part of the reason we're able to do this. So yeah,
Yeah.
I think people might.
Someone just told me, someone told me the other day, they said they were talking to a company, a big broadband company. They said they just finally lit up the last piece of fiber that they'd laid in 2001. So,
Exactly. No, right. That's exactly right. That they over-invested in this stuff. And but it pays off in the end. And so like we're probably in that cycle where things are over-investing. The one thing I will say though is I'm not I know a lot of people are very pessimistic because they say, well, if not for Nvidia and what Magnificent Seven, whatever the acronym of the day is, then the stock market would be doing terribly. I'm not sure that's entirely right. I think that there is a good argument to be had that some of those stocks are actually sucking up the investment that would
mm,
otherwise go into other stocks. That's not terrific, right? But it doesn't mean that the future is dark and this bubble will burst and we wouldn't be growing without it. I think that a lot of the money that would otherwise go into other parts of the market are going into this because that's it's really hard to be an investment manager and be like, yeah, you could have decided a year, 2 years ago that like Nvidia was a bubble, right? Like, oh, it's up 1,000%. I got to get out. And now you lost your job and all your clients because you got them out and the stock went up another 1,000%, right? This is, that's dangerous. That's how bubbles happen. It's everybody's afraid that they're going to lose their job for not investing in the hot thing. But again, like I said, I think like we've gone through bubbles before. There was a railroad bubble, there was a South Seas bubble, there was, that actually end up becoming important parts of the economy. Not everything is tulip mania, right? Where
mhm.
people just invest in things that are worthless. Eventually, sometimes these bubbles work out. Not every time, but I'm a little bit more reassured about like the ultimate consequences of this, even if I worry about the valuations of some of these companies right now.
Yeah. Well, and it's a good point to the sort of almost sucking up the investment that you can look past the share prices to earnings. I mean, as long as the, earnings
Right.
growth of the industrials are healthy, yeah, they might not be seeing the same share price appreciation, but it tells that same story that, miraculously imposing tariffs and tightening up on immigration has not led to the collapse of Western civilization.
Right.
And we will live to fight another day. So, John Carney, thank you so much for making the time. This was a ton of fun. Thank you for all your work at Breitbart. We will be reading carefully.
Thanks, Oren. I'm glad to have do this. Let's do it again soon.
Absolutely. And we will be back again soon with another episode of the American Compass podcast.